Montana Territory. August 1879, the sun was barely up when Gideon Lark stepped out of the barn and saw the side door swinging open. He froze. That door had been bolted shut the night before. His hand slid to the colt on his hip and he moved slow, boots crunching over dry earth, eyes sharp. He had not worked 16 years to build this life alone just to have it taken by some drifter. He pushed the barn door wider and stepped inside. And there she was, curled up in the hayloft, tangled in his horse's blanket, lay a woman. Straw clung to her dark dress, her hair falling loose around her face, and the curve of her body pressed into the hay like she had not slept in weeks. Gideon did not move for a full minute. He just watched her breathing, slow and shallow, like she was afraid to take up too much space. Then she stirred, her eyes blinked open, startled. She sat up fast, shoulders braced like she expected to be struck. Gideon held up both hands. "I do not mean you harm," he said, "but you are sleeping in my barn." She looked around quick, like she had forgotten where she was. Her voice was hoarse. "I am sorry. I needed a place for the night. I did not take anything, I swear it." Gideon studied her. She looked about 30, maybe a little younger. Her dress was torn at the hem. Her boots were muddy. She was too clean to be a drunk, too thin to be a traveler with coin. "What is your name?" he asked. "Keziah Vance." He nodded once. "Gideon Lark. You hungry?" She hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. He motioned toward the house. "Come on." She followed without a word. Inside, he set bread and beans on the table, poured water from the pitcher. She sat rigid in the chair but ate like she had not had a meal in days. Gideon leaned against the counter and watched her. "You got family?" he asked. She paused, eyes dropping. "None left." He waited. "My husband died last winter. Consumption. We were living in Livingston. I lost the house 2 months after he passed. I walked west with what I had, ran out of everything near here." "You walked from Livingston," she nodded. "I tried to find work. No one hires a widow with no people." Gideon frowned. "You've been on foot this whole time." "Mostly." He crossed his arms. "You could have been hurt, or worse." "I was," she said softly. A long silence passed. Keziah did not explain further, and Gideon did not ask. "You can stay in the bunkhouse," he said finally. "It is dry and no one else is using it. I do not want charity." "It is not charity. It is a clean place to sleep." She looked at him for a long second, then nodded. "Thank you." That night, Gideon lay in bed staring at the ceiling. He had not had anyone on this land but cattle and a few passing ranch hands in years. He built this place after his heart got torn straight out of him by a woman who chose a banker in Helena over a cowboy with rough hands and a slow way of talking. He had not let anyone close since. But when he looked at Keziah across the table, something in him stirred that had been quiet a long time. Not desire. Not yet. Something older than that. Something deeper. The next morning she did not leave. She had already fed the chickens when he came out. Her hair was tied back, her sleeves rolled. She nodded when she saw him. "I do not expect to stay free," she said. "I can work. You know how to handle livestock. I grew up on a sheep farm in Illinois. I can manage chickens and horses just fine." He nodded. "All right." By the 3rd day she was helping mend fence. By the 7th, she had cleaned the bunkhouse top to bottom and moved the old pots and pans to the outer shed. She did not talk much, but she listened when he did. When he told her about how his father died in a blizzard trying to get salt for the cattle, how his mother had not lasted much longer after that, how he built this place with his own 2 hands, she just nodded and said, "I know what it is to lose." One afternoon, a storm rolled in from the west. Gideon was out in the pasture securing gates. She came running through the rain, skirts soaked to her knees. "The wind's bad, you need help." They worked together, tying down the canvas over the hay, getting the horses secured. Lightning cracked the sky. Rain hit hard and fast. When they finally got inside the barn, both of them were soaked through, laughing, breathless. Keziah looked up at him, eyes wide. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded. "I forgot what it felt like, to laugh." Gideon reached out slowly and tucked a strand of wet hair behind her ear. She did not pull away. That night she stayed by the fire longer than usual. He handed her a cup of coffee. She wrapped her hands around it and stared into the flames. "My husband was kind," she said. "But it was not love, not the kind you read about. I think I settled. I was afraid to be alone." Gideon sat beside her. "I know what it is to be afraid of that." She looked at him. "You ever been in love?" He nodded. "Long time ago." "What happened?" "She married someone safe." Keziah's mouth pulled into something between a smile and a sigh. "Safe is not always better." He looked at her, her face soft in the firelight, eyes tired but steady. "You are not safe," he murmured. "No," she said, "but I am real." He reached for her hand. She let him take it. And for the first time in 16 years, Gideon Lark felt something grow in the place he had kept empty. Something warm. Something steady. Something he did not know he needed until he found her sleeping in his hay. Keziah stood at the edge of the creek behind the barn. Skirts hiked above her boots as she rinsed clothes on the flat rock Gideon had carried down for her that morning. The sun was climbing, warm on her back, and the cottonwood leaves whispered overhead. She wrung out a shirt, arms aching in a good way, like she'd earned the soreness. Gideon was farther up the hill, mending the windmill with a quiet focus she'd come to recognize. He worked like everything mattered, hands steady, movements sure, never in a rush but always with purpose. She studied him for a moment before going back to her washing. When he came down, his sleeves were rolled and his forearms streaked with grease. He crouched beside her and dipped a tin cup in the creek, drinking deep. "You ever work in a kitchen?" he asked without preamble. She glanced at him. "What kind of kitchen?" "One that feeds more than 2 people. I helped my aunt cook for a logging camp one summer in Illinois. 40 men, 3 meals a day. Why?" "Neighbor down the road's missus took a fall, broke her hip. They've got 4 little ones and no one to keep the place running. He came by this morning, asked if I knew anyone could spare a few days." Keziah folded a damp sleeve between her palms. "You want me to go?" I told him I'd ask. He'd pay in flour and dried goods, maybe some tools. They're decent folks. She nodded slowly. "I can leave at first light. You'd be back by Sunday, all right." He rose and offered a hand to help her up. She took it, and his grip was firm, calloused but warm. She didn't let go right away. "I wouldn't ask if I didn't think you could handle it," he added. "I know." That evening he brought out a box of old fabric scraps from the loft above the stable. "My mother quilted," he said. "Used to save every bit of cloth. I can't bring myself to throw it out." Keziah sat cross-legged on the porch, sorting the pieces by size and color. "Some of these are still good. You mind if I sew them into something useful? Do what you like." She held up a square of faded blue calico. "This was a dress once." He leaned against the post and watched her fingers move. "You always notice things like that?" "I didn't used to. After David died, I started looking closer. Little things hold more weight when the big things are gone." He didn't answer right away. Then, "I fixed the roof over the chicken shed today. Been meaning to for months, you being here. Things get seen to quicker." She looked up. "You think I've made you efficient?" A flicker of a smile touched his mouth. "I think you've made me more willing." They sat in quiet until the stars came out. Before dawn the next morning, she packed a satchel with bread and a jar of beans. He saddled her a mare from the corral, a calm gray named Lottie. She wore his old coat over her shoulders, too big in the sleeves but warm. "You ride careful," he said, tightening the cinch. "I will. If they treat you poorly, they won't, and if they do, I'll ride back." He nodded once. "I'll be here." She hesitated, then reached up and laid a hand on his chest. "Thank you, Gideon." He covered her hand with his. "For what?" "For seeing me." He watched her ride off down the trail, dust rising in the pale light. When she disappeared over the ridge, he turned back toward the house, already feeling the quiet settle in. The days moved slower without her. He fixed the fence along the northern boundary and watered the beans in the garden she'd started. He found one of her hairpins on the porch rail and left it where it was. At night, he built the fire high and sat longer than he needed to. When Sunday came, he rode out at first light and waited on the rise above the neighbor's land. She appeared just after the sun broke the horizon, riding Lottie with a flour sack tied behind her. He met her halfway. "You all right?" he asked. They were kind. "The children have loud feet." He reached for her reins and walked beside her. "You're a sight I've missed." She looked over at him, tired but smiling. "You don't seem the type to say things like that." "I'm not, but it's true." They rode the rest of the way in silence. When they reached the barn, she dismounted and handed him the flour sack. "I brought you something." He opened it, then lifted out a crooked little quilt stitched from the scraps, seams uneven, corners soft. "For the bunkhouse," she said. He looked at her, then folded it carefully over his arm. "Or the porch, where you can sit with it." She nodded once. "All right." They walked toward the porch together, boots in step, and the quiet between them felt full. The first hard frost came early that year. By October, the mornings cracked white across the pasture, and the sky held a pale stillness that meant snow wasn't far behind. Keziah stood at the edge of the garden rows, pulling the last of the withered beans into her apron. Her fingers ached from the cold, but she worked without pause, eyes scanning for anything else worth saving. The earth was hard beneath her boots, summer long gone. Inside the house, Gideon was repairing the stovepipe that had shifted in the wind the night before. When she came in, he nodded toward the hearth. "Fire's low. You can warm up." She knelt beside it, untying her apron and laying it across the chair. "We'll need to put straw down in the coop. The hens won't last through the freeze. I'll see to it after supper." He straightened from the stove and brushed soot from his hands. "I'll be going into Miles City tomorrow. Need salt, kerosene, and a spare axe handle." She turned, brows lifting. "That's a full day's ride." He nodded. "I'll take the wagon, be gone overnight." Her hands stilled. "You want me to stay here? I trust you with it." She stood. "I'll watch the stock and keep the fire going. But if anything's wrong when you're back, if the roof leaks or the well goes dry, I want to be able to tell you proper." His mouth curved, slow and quiet. "That's why I trust you." She didn't answer, just reached for the kettle and poured water into the tin basin. Her movements were slower now, more certain, like the space belonged to her in some quiet way. He watched her check the latch on the window, her fingers brushing the sill where the draft slipped through. That evening he brought the wagon into the barn and checked each wheel with a lantern. She came in carrying a bundle of dried herbs, her braid tucked under a shawl. "You'll need something for the road." She held out a cloth-wrapped packet. "Sun-dried apples and a bit of smoked meat. Not much, but it'll keep." He took it, careful with the cloth. "You didn't have to." "I know. That's why I did." The next morning she stood on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, as he climbed onto the wagon seat. "I'll be back before sundown Thursday," he said. "I'll be here." He looked at her a moment longer. Then he clicked to the horses and rolled down the trail, leaving only dust and the sound of creaking harness behind. The house felt too still after that. She passed the time by splitting kindling, stringing dried squash in the cellar rafters, and washing the curtains with lye soap and boiling water. The rhythm of chores filled the silence, but the absence of his voice, his boots on the step. The way he leaned into the doorway when he read the weather, those things left a hollow that work couldn't quite fill. That night, wind howled against the shutters. She sat by the fire, wrapped in Gideon's coat, the quilt she'd stitched draped across her lap. The walls groaned. The horses shifted in the barn. She didn't sleep much. By Thursday afternoon, the air warmed just enough to soften the frost. She stood at the gate, watching the ridge. When the wagon finally crested the rise, her breath left her in a rush. He climbed down stiffly, eyes scanning the roof, the lean-to, the smoke curling from the chimney. Everything hold. The barn door came loose during the wind. I hammered it back. One of the hens isn't laying. He nodded, then reached for the sack behind the seat. Got you something, she blinked. Me, it's not much. He handed her a folded square of fabric, soft and faded red. Saw it in the mercantile. Thought it might suit for a new apron. She ran her thumb along the seam. You thought of me while you were gone. I didn't stop. She looked up at him, wind lifting strands of her hair. You're not a man who speaks just to fill the air. No, he said. But I always mean what I say. She stepped closer. Then let me say something too. I thought I'd forgotten what it felt like to want to stay, but I remembered. He reached for her hand, slow and sure. You don't have to go anywhere. I don't want to. He bent his head and their foreheads touched, quiet and still. No rush. No need. Just the wind softening, the horses easing in the pasture, and the sound of her breath steady in the space between them. There was no need to say more. Everything that mattered was already held in the warmth of their joined hands. The first snow came 3 days after Gideon returned from Miles City. It fell light at first, just a dusting over the hills, but by nightfall, the sky dropped heavy with it, blanketing the pasture and softening the edges of every fence post and rail. By morning, the world had gone quiet under white. Inside the house, the hearth burned hot. Keziah stood barefoot on the braided rug, drying her feet after coming in from the coop. She'd used the old saddle blanket to cover the nesting boxes, and her hands were still red from brushing snow off the roof. You'll catch your death, Gideon said, kneeling to stir the fire. Boots stay on when there's snow on the ground. She sat down beside the stove, rubbing her ankles. They were soaked through. I left them by the door. He reached for a dry towel and set it beside her. Then he poured coffee into 2 tin mugs and handed her one. They sat there, steam curling between them, the storm muting everything outside. She tipped her head toward the window. I never hated snow till I had to walk through it. You won't be walking through this one, he said. You're not going anywhere unless you want to. I know. He took a drink, then set the mug down. I've been thinking. Come spring, I could hire someone to help with the cattle drive, keep the work closer to home. She looked over at him slowly. You've always done it yourself. I've always done a lot of things myself. Doesn't mean I have to keep on. She traced the rim of her cup. What would you do with the time? Build another room on the house. Maybe a root cellar. Fix the west pasture gate. Things I've let go too long, she hesitated. Would you want help with those? I'd want you in them. She didn't answer right away. The fire popped behind them. Finally, she said, I never thought I'd be part of someone's plans again. You're already in mine. That afternoon, they brought the horses into the lower barn where it was warmer. Lottie tossed her head when Keziah brushed her mane, the snow melting in rivulets along her flanks. Gideon was checking the harness straps on the gelding when he said, There's something I've been meaning to ask you. She kept brushing, but her hand slowed. All right. That first night, when I found you in the loft, you looked like you'd already been run half to death. But you weren't afraid of me, not really. Why? She finished one last stroke before answering. Because you didn't look away, he straightened. What do you mean? Most men look through you or around you. You didn't. You saw me and didn't flinch. I figured that meant I could rest, at least for a while. He stepped closer. You've never been just passing through, Keziah. I know that now. They walked back to the house as the light faded. Snow crunched underfoot. The sky had turned the color of ash, stars veiled behind thick cloud. Inside, she set a pot of beans on the stove while Gideon took his rifle down to clean it. Midway through supper, he said, "There's a preacher who comes through every third Sunday, stays in a room above the smithy. Next time he's here, I thought maybe we could speak to him." Her spoon stilled. "I'm not asking to change what we have," he said. "I just want to mark it proper. Let folks know you're not just some woman in my house. You're the one I chose." She looked at him then, eyes steady. "And if I say yes, what would you expect of me? Just to stay?" "That's all I've ever wanted." She set her spoon down and reached across the table, fingers wrapping around his. "Then you already have it." Outside, snow kept falling. But inside, the fire burned steady and two hands stayed joined across the table, sure in what they'd built. Not by luck. Not by rescue, but by choice. The preacher arrived on the third Sunday just after sunrise, as promised. His wagon carried a worn Bible and a roll of canvas for makeshift services, but his eyes were kind and his voice low, with the cadence of a man used to listening more than he spoke. Gideon met him at the gate and brought him to the house, where Keziah had already swept the floor twice and laid out a clean cloth across the table. She wore a simple blue dress one she hadn't touched since Illinois. It had been tucked in the bottom of her satchel, wrapped in a bit of muslin, the last thing she'd managed to keep from her old life. The sleeves were too loose now, the waist hung different from when she last wore it, but she hadn't reached for it until today. She didn't need it to feel ready, but she wanted it. The preacher stayed only as long as needed. Words were said, vows spoken with no trembling, no hesitation. Gideon held her hand as if he'd been doing it every day for 30 years. There were no guests, no music, no ring, just the wind outside and the scent of wood smoke and bread rising in the oven. When the preacher left, Gideon walked him down the trail, came back, and stood in the doorway, looking at her like he hadn't quite figured out how a house could feel so much like a home just for having one person in it. "Feels different," he said. "Not between us. Just the knowing." She took his hand again, thumb brushing the callus below his knuckle. "It feels right." That night they sat on the porch. The snow had melted down to patches along the fence line, and the sky opened wide enough to show stars. Gideon had dragged out the rocking chair from the front room, placed it beside the bench so she could sit with her feet curled under her. The quilt she'd stitched months ago was across her knees, faded from washing, soft from use. "You ever miss Illinois?" he asked after a long while. "I miss the river and the sound of locusts in July, but nothing there would have led me here." He leaned back, boots crossed at the ankle. "I used to think this place would never hold more than fence posts and cattle. But now I see it different." "How?" Like it was waiting. She turned toward him, face half shadowed by starlight. "Do you think we'll ever have more people here? I mean more than just the two of us." He didn't answer right away. "Then, if we do, it'll be because we're meant to. If we don't, it'll still be enough." She nodded and her hand slid into his. "I think I'd like to teach someone to read." He looked at her, eyes warm. "You'd be good at that." "I never thought I'd want anything more than rest. But now I want roots." "You've got them here," he said. "And so do I." The next weeks passed without trouble. Snow came again, but softer this time. Keziah made preserves from the last of the dried apples. Gideon built a new shelf in the root cellar, then carved her name into the edge of the door frame, just small, just once. She noticed it without him saying, ran her fingers over the letters and didn't speak, but her eyes said everything. In March, a letter came from the neighbor's wife, the one Keziah had helped that first autumn. It was brought by a passing trader and sealed with wax. Inside was a short note and a small set of hand-stitched table napkins. "For your new life," the note said. "You were a grace to us. May you find it returned." Keziah tucked it into the Bible on the mantel. By the end of April, the ground thawed enough to start planting. Gideon turned the soil beside the barn, and Keziah laid rows for carrots and turnips. They worked in silence often, but it was the kind that wrapped around a person like a good coat, nothing missing, nothing tight, just right. One morning, as they stacked kindling near the smokehouse, Keziah paused and pressed a hand to her belly. Not in alarm, just thoughtful, Gideon noticed. "Something wrong." "No," she said. "Just something new." He waited, eyes steady. She looked at him with a quiet certainty. "I think we'll need that extra room after all." He stepped closer, not surprised, not shaken, just full of something deep and grateful. "Then I'll build it strong." Spring came in full after that. The creek ran thick with snowmelt, and the trees on the ridge budded soft green. They slept with the windows open again, and each morning Gideon rose first, made coffee, and listened for the sound of her footsteps. He never missed them. Years passed, but the days never felt rushed. The house grew, the porch widened. One child came, then another. Keziah taught them to read by lamplight, and Gideon built them a swing from a length of rope and a pine board. They buried the old mare under the cottonwoods and planted a lilac bush above her grave. When summer storms came, they watched them from the porch, hands clasped, boots side by side. They didn't talk about what life had been before they didn't need to. It was stitched into the way they moved around each other, the way Gideon never left the gate unlatched, the way Keziah always set his coffee just to the left of his plate, where he reached without looking. Love didn't come loud for them. It came steady, and it stayed.